Some animals cry for help. Others carry a secret for years before anyone finally learns to listen. The storm arrived just after sunset, rolling across the mountains of western Montana like a dark curtain. Rain hammered the roof of Cedar Valley Animal Shelter, rattling windows and drowning out the distant rumble of traffic on the highway. Inside the aging building, most of the kennels had already settled into uneasy silence. Dogs slept curled on blankets. Cats watched the rain from their enclosures. The scent of disinfectant mixed with damp fur and wet earth drifting through the ventilation system. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood alone in the examination room, reviewing paperwork beneath the pale glow of fluorescent lights. At 45, she had spent more than 2 decades caring for animals that nobody else wanted. Strays, abandoned pets, forgotten companions. She had seen miracles before. She had also seen heartbreak. Usually, she could tell the difference. Tonight felt different. A sudden bark echoed down the hallway. Then another. Sarah looked up immediately. The sound had come from the maternity kennel at the far end of the shelter. She set down her clipboard and hurried through the corridor. Rain lashed against the windows beside her. Emergency lights flickered briefly as thunder rolled overhead. When she reached the kennel, she found Grace pacing in circles. The German Shepherd's sable coat shimmered beneath the dim lighting. Her amber eyes appeared wide and restless. Sarah knelt beside the gate. "Easy, girl," she whispered. Grace had arrived at the shelter only 3 weeks earlier. No microchip, no collar, no owner. Just a pregnant German Shepherd found wandering alone along a rural highway nearly 30 miles outside town. She had been gentle from the beginning, but cautious, as though she carried memories she could not quite let go of. Sarah opened the kennel door and stepped inside. Grace immediately approached her. Not for comfort, not for food. She simply stared into Sarah's eyes. Then she looked toward the door. Sarah frowned. "What is it?" Grace shifted uncomfortably. Another contraction passed through her body. The labor had begun. Sarah checked her watch and reached for supplies. Outside, lightning flashed behind the rain-soaked windows. The shelter lights flickered again. For a brief second, the room fell into darkness before emergency backup power restored a faint glow. Grace remained standing. Most dogs preparing to give birth focused on finding a secure place to settle. Grace did the opposite. She kept turning toward the doorway. Watching, waiting, listening. Sarah spread fresh blankets across the floor. "Come on, sweetheart. Right here." Grace obeyed, but even after lying down, her attention never left the entrance. Minutes passed. The storm intensified. Wind rattled the building. Somewhere in the shelter, another dog barked nervously. Then the first puppy arrived. Small, healthy, strong. Sarah smiled with relief. Yet something felt strange. Grace barely looked at her newborn. Instead, she lifted her head and stared toward the hallway again. Another puppy followed. Then another. Each one healthy. Each one perfect. But Grace continued searching the doorway, as if expecting someone to walk through it at any moment. Sarah had assisted hundreds of births over the years. She had never seen anything quite like this. The mother was not afraid. She was not confused. She was waiting. And for reasons Sarah could not explain, she suddenly felt that whoever, or whatever, Grace was waiting for had something to do with a story that had not yet been told. The storm continued through most of the night. Rain streamed down the shelter windows in silver sheets while wind moaned around the corners of the building. Inside the maternity room, the newborn puppies slept in a warm cluster beneath fresh blankets. Their tiny breaths rose and fell in quiet rhythm. The crisis had passed. At least it should have. Yet Grace remained restless. Sarah noticed it immediately. Most mothers became completely focused on their puppies after delivery. They cleaned them, counted them, guarded them. Grace did those things only briefly. Every few minutes her attention drifted back toward the doorway. Her ears would lift. Her amber eyes would lock onto the empty hall. Then she would wait, watching, listening, hoping. Sarah sat beside the kennel with a notebook balanced on her knee. She had intended to document the birth and head home before dawn. Instead, she found herself studying Grace. The behavior made no sense. "Who are you looking for?" she asked quietly. Grace turned toward her for a moment, then back to the door, as if the answer stood somewhere beyond it. By sunrise, the storm had weakened into a steady drizzle. Pale gray light filtered through the clouds outside. Volunteers began arriving for their morning shifts. The shelter slowly filled with familiar sounds. Kennel doors opened. Food bowls rattled. Phones started ringing at the front desk. Yet Grace reacted to every footstep in the hallway. Every voice. Every opening door. Each time, anticipation flashed across her face. Each time, disappointment followed. Sarah could not stop thinking about it. Around mid-morning, she performed a routine post-delivery examination. The puppies appeared healthy. Their heartbeats were strong. Their breathing was normal. Everything looked exactly as it should. Grace cooperated calmly through the process. Then Sarah reached beneath the dog's neck to check for irritation around an old patch of matted fur. Her fingers paused. Something was there, hidden deep beneath the thick sable coat. Sarah frowned. It felt too solid to be tangled hair, too small to be medical equipment. Carefully, she parted the fur. Grace remained perfectly still. Sarah leaned closer. Beneath layers of worn fur rested a thin leather cord, nearly invisible, nearly fused into the coat after years of wear. "Well now," Sarah whispered. "What do we have here?" The cord disappeared beneath the fur near Grace's chest. Sarah gently loosened it. Something metallic slid free. A small object no larger than a silver dollar emerged from beneath the tangled strands. Time had darkened its surface. Scratches covered the metal. Dirt filled the tiny grooves. Yet it was unmistakably intentional. This was not random debris. It belonged there. Grace watched silently as Sarah lifted the object into the light. The dog did not resist. In fact, she seemed relieved, as though she had been carrying it for a very long time. Sarah examined the piece carefully. It was a small pendant attached to the weathered leather cord. Old, handmade, personal. Her pulse quickened. Shelters received abandoned animals every year. Most arrived with nothing. No names. No history. No clues. Grace might be different. Sarah turned the pendant over in her hand. The metal caught a beam of morning sunlight slipping through the window. Something appeared along the edge. A tiny seam. The pendant opened. Sarah stared at it. Then she looked toward Grace. The German Shepherd was watching her with the same intense expression she had worn throughout the entire night. Waiting. Not for food. Not for comfort. Waiting for this exact moment. And somehow Sarah knew that whatever lay hidden inside that pendant was about to explain why Grace had spent the entire night searching the doorway for someone who never came. Sarah carried the pendant into her office and carefully closed the door behind her. Outside, the shelter had fully awakened. Volunteers moved through the hallways. Phones rang. Dogs barked. Yet inside the small office, everything felt strangely quiet. The worn pendant rested in the center of her desk beneath a pool of morning light. Years of scratches covered the metal surface. The leather cord attached to it looked as though it had survived countless miles, storms, and seasons. Sarah sat down slowly. Through the window, she could see Grace lying beside her puppies in the maternity kennel. Even from a distance, the German Shepherd seemed focused on the office. Waiting. Watching. Sarah took a careful breath and examined the tiny clasp. The mechanism resisted at first. Dirt and time had nearly sealed it shut. Finally, with a soft click, the pendant opened. Sarah froze. Inside was a photograph. Tiny. Faded. Protected for years within the metal case. She leaned closer. The image showed a smiling little girl, no older than 10. Sunlight illuminated her face. Her arms were wrapped around the neck of a young German Shepherd. The dog's ears stood proudly. Its eyes appeared bright and alert. Sarah's pulse quickened. The resemblance was unmistakable. The dog in the photograph looked remarkably similar to Grace. Not just the coat color. Not just the facial structure. There was something familiar in the eyes. Something impossible to ignore. Beneath the photograph sat a folded piece of paper no larger than a postage stamp. Sarah carefully removed it. The edges had yellowed with age. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it. Written in faded blue ink were 4 simple words. "Come home, Daisy." Sarah read the message again. Then again. Daisy. The name lingered in her thoughts. She turned back toward the photograph. The little girl smiled from another time, another life. The message felt less like identification and more like a promise. Or perhaps a wish. A wish that had never been fulfilled. Sarah immediately searched the shelter intake records. Grace had arrived without a name. Animal control officers had simply listed her as female German Shepherd. Estimated age, 8 years. Found wandering alone. No owner located. Sarah stared at the screen. 8 years. Her eyes drifted back to the pendant. A coincidence seemed unlikely. The age matched too closely. She looked toward the kennel again. Grace had finally lowered her head beside the puppies. Yet she was not sleeping. Her amber eyes remained open, fixed on Sarah, as though she knew exactly what had been discovered. One of the shelter volunteers knocked softly and entered the office. "Everything okay?" she asked. Sarah held up the photograph. "I think this dog had a family." The volunteer studied the image. "Do you think that is her?" Sarah did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the tiny note resting in her hand. "Come home, Daisy." For simple words that somehow felt heavier than the pendant itself. Outside, sunlight finally broke through the storm clouds. Golden light spilled across the shelter parking lot. For the first time since Grace had arrived, Sarah felt certain of one thing. The German shepherd sleeping beside those newborn puppies was not a forgotten stray. She belonged to a story, and somewhere beyond the shelter walls, there might still be someone who had never stopped waiting for her to come home. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon chasing a trail that should not have existed. Between appointments, vaccinations, and checking on Grace and her puppies, she searched every database she could access. Lost pet registries, shelter archives, county animal reports. Most searches ended the same way. Dead ends, outdated records, missing information. Yet the photograph and the note refused to leave her thoughts. "Come home, Daisy." The words felt personal, not something created for identification. They sounded like the plea of someone who truly loved a dog and never stopped hoping she would return. Outside, the storm clouds had finally broken apart. Sunlight washed across the mountains beyond town, turning the wet landscape gold. Inside the shelter, Grace appeared calmer than she had since arriving. Her puppies slept beside her, their tiny bodies pressed together for warmth. Yet every time Sarah entered the room, Grace watched her carefully, almost expectantly, as if she knew the search had begun. Late that evening, after most volunteers had gone home, Sarah sat alone in her office with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her keyboard. She enlarged the photograph again and studied every detail. The little girl appeared around 10 years old. Behind her stood a white farmhouse porch decorated with flower pots. One corner of a mailbox was visible near the edge of the image. Sarah zoomed in further. A name had been painted on the side. The picture quality was poor, but several letters could still be read. H-A-R-P. Sarah straightened in her chair. Harper. It was not much, but it was more than she had before. She searched county property records from surrounding towns. Hundreds of results appeared. Most were useless. Then one caught her attention. Harper Family Farm, located nearly 80 miles away in a rural valley outside Livingston. The property had been sold years earlier. Sarah opened archived local news articles connected to the address. Her heartbeat quickened. One article dated 8 years ago showed a photograph of a family standing in front of a farmhouse. Sarah leaned closer. There she was, the same little girl from the pendant. Older news reports described a community search for a missing German shepherd named Daisy that had disappeared during a severe storm. Despite weeks of searching, the dog had never been found. Sarah stared at the screen. 8 years. For 8 years, someone had wondered what happened. For 8 years, a family had carried that loss. Her eyes drifted toward the maternity room across the hallway. Grace was sleeping now, surrounded by her puppies. A forgotten shelter dog, a wandering stray, a mother, and perhaps, incredibly, a dog who had spent nearly a decade carrying the last connection to her first home. Sarah printed the article and studied the image again. The little girl looked happy. Her arm wrapped around Daisy's neck exactly as it appeared in the pendant photograph. Then Sarah noticed something she had missed before. Around Daisy's neck hung the same leather cord, the same pendant. Her breath caught. The evidence was no longer a coincidence. It was a story waiting to be completed. Somewhere out there, the little girl in the photograph was no longer a child. She would be an adult now. Sarah looked through the office window toward Grace. The German shepherd opened her eyes at that exact moment and met her gaze. For the first time since the labor began, Sarah thought she understood why Grace had spent the entire night staring at the shelter door. She was not waiting for a stranger. She was waiting for someone she had been trying to find her way back to for 8 long years. The next morning arrived bright and clear. The mountains beyond Cedar Valley Animal Shelter stood sharp against a cloudless blue sky, as though the storm had never happened. Sunlight spilled through the kennel windows, warming the floors and filling the building with a sense of calm. Yet Sarah barely noticed. Her thoughts remained fixed on the photograph, the pendant, and the name that had quietly resurfaced after 8 long years. Daisy. Before the shelter officially opened, she sat at her desk and stared at a phone number displayed on her computer screen. It had taken hours of searching through public records, social media accounts, and archived information to find it. One name appeared repeatedly in connection with the old Harper family farm. Emma Harper, the little girl from the photograph. No longer a child. 22 years old now. Sarah hesitated before making the call. What if she was wrong? What if Grace was not Daisy after all? What if reopening an old wound caused more pain than hope? Across the hallway, Grace rested beside her puppies. The German Shepherd looked peaceful this morning, more peaceful than Sarah had ever seen her. Yet when Sarah glanced toward the maternity room, Grace opened her eyes and watched her. Waiting. The same silent expectation remained. Sarah picked up the phone. The call rang several times before a young woman's voice answered. Hello. Sarah introduced herself carefully. There was a brief pause when she mentioned the shelter. Another pause when she mentioned an old photograph. Then silence. Sarah could almost hear the woman breathing on the other end of the line. Why are you asking about that? Emma finally whispered. Sarah looked down at the pendant resting beside her keyboard. Because I think I may have found someone important. The silence that followed felt endless. Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah explained everything. The pregnant German Shepherd. The labor. The hidden pendant. The photograph. The note. She described Grace in detail. Her age. Her appearance. The small scar near one ear. The unique markings across her chest. By the end of the conversation, Emma was crying softly. We searched for her for months, she said. Every day after school. Every weekend. My parents never stopped looking. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. 8 years of wondering. 8 years without answers. Can you send me the photograph? Emma asked. Sarah immediately emailed a high-resolution image of the pendant's contents. Less than 5 minutes later, her phone rang again. Emma was crying harder now. That is her, she said. That is Daisy. That is absolutely Daisy. Sarah felt a chill move through her chest. Even though she had suspected it, hearing the confirmation made everything feel suddenly real. Grace was not simply connected to Daisy. She was Daisy. Somehow, against impossible odds, she had survived years alone and found her way to the shelter carrying the same pendant she had worn as a young dog. Sarah looked toward the maternity kennel. Grace had risen to her feet. She stood quietly at the gate watching the office. Watching Sarah. Watching the phone. As though she somehow understood every word that had been spoken. There is something else, Emma said softly. You said she had puppies? Sarah smiled. 5 healthy puppies. Another long silence followed. Then Emma laughed through tears. That sounds exactly like Daisy. She always found a way to bring more love into people's lives. Sarah hung up nearly an hour later. Outside, sunlight danced across the parking lot. Inside the shelter, 5 tiny puppies slept beside a mother who had just unknowingly solved an 8-year-old mystery. But as Sarah looked at Grace standing quietly behind the kennel gate, she realized the story was not finished. Because the one person Daisy had spent years waiting for still had not walked through the shelter door. 2 days passed before Emma arrived. During that time, Sarah found herself watching Grace more closely than ever. The German Shepherd spent nearly every hour beside her puppies, caring for them with patient devotion. Yet one habit never changed. Whenever footsteps echoed through the shelter entrance, Grace immediately looked toward the door. Every single time. Delivery drivers, volunteers, potential adopters. She checked each arrival with the same quiet hope. Then she returned to her puppies. It was as though part of her still believed someone important was coming. On the 3rd afternoon, a silver pickup truck pulled into the shelter parking lot. Sarah happened to be organizing supplies near the front desk when she noticed it through the window. A young woman stepped out and paused beside the vehicle. For a moment, she simply stood there looking at the building. Sarah recognized her instantly from social media photographs. Emma Harper. She was taller now than the little girl in the pendant photograph. Her dark blonde hair rested against the shoulders of a worn denim jacket. Yet her eyes were exactly the same. Nervous, hopeful, afraid to believe. Sarah walked outside to greet her. Neither woman spoke much during the first few moments. Some situations felt too important for small talk. Emma clutched a printed copy of the old photograph as they entered the shelter together. The hallway seemed unusually quiet. Even the dogs appeared calmer than normal. Sarah led her toward the maternity room. As they approached, Emma's footsteps slowed. Her breathing became uneven. 8 years of memories crowded into a few short yards of hallway. Finally, they reached the kennel door. Grace was resting beside her puppies. The German Shepherd lifted her head casually at first. Then everything changed. Her ears rose instantly. Her body became still. Completely still. Sarah felt a chill run through her arms. Grace stared at Emma. Emma stared at Grace. Neither moved. Neither made a sound. For several seconds, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Grace stood. Slowly, carefully, she walked toward the kennel gate. Her tail began to move. Once, then again. Emma covered her mouth with both hands. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. "Daisy," she whispered. The German Shepherd reached the gate and pressed forward. A soft sound escaped her throat. Not a bark. Not a whine. Something gentler. Something filled with recognition. Sarah opened the gate. The moment it swung open, Grace stepped directly toward Emma. There was no hesitation. No uncertainty. She buried her face against Emma's chest exactly as though 8 years had been 8 minutes. Emma dropped to her knees. Tears streamed down her face as she wrapped her arms around the dog she had never stopped missing. Around them, shelter staff quietly gathered in the doorway. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to interrupt the moment. Grace remained pressed against Emma, her tail sweeping across the floor while her puppies slept peacefully nearby. Watching them together, Sarah finally understood the reason behind the endless waiting at the door. Grace had not been searching for a place. She had been searching for a person. And somehow, through 8 years, countless miles, and an entire lifetime of uncertainty, she had carried one small pendant and one impossible hope all the way back home. The reunion changed something inside the shelter. For days afterward, even the volunteers seemed to move a little more gently through the hallways. People spoke in softer voices. Smiles appeared more easily. The story spread quickly through the small Montana community, and visitors often stopped by simply to see the German Shepherd who had somehow found her way back after 8 years. Yet the most remarkable moments happened when nobody was watching. Emma began visiting every day. Sometimes she arrived before work. Sometimes she came in the evening carrying coffee for Sarah and treats for the shelter staff. But no matter what time she arrived, the result was always the same. Grace would hear her footsteps before anyone else. Her ears would lift. Her tail would begin to wag. Then she would move toward the kennel door with the same excitement she had once reserved for the shelter entrance. The waiting was over. One quiet afternoon, Sarah sat beside Emma in the maternity room while the puppies slept. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns across the blankets. Grace lay stretched beside her puppies, her head resting near Emma's feet. For a while neither woman spoke. They simply listened to the soft sounds of sleeping puppies and the distant activity of the shelter. Finally, Sarah asked the question that had been lingering in her mind. "What happened?" Emma looked down at Grace and smiled sadly. "The storm." Sarah nodded. She remembered reading about it in the old newspaper articles. Emma gently stroked Grace's fur. "I was 14. A storm rolled through the valley one night. A fence gate blew open. Daisy disappeared before morning." Her voice softened. "We searched everywhere. My parents put up flyers. Neighbors helped. We checked shelters in 3 counties. For months." Grace lifted her head slightly at the sound of her old name. Emma's eyes glistened. "Eventually everyone told us to move on." She laughed quietly. "But I never did." Sarah listened without interrupting. Emma reached into her purse and removed a worn wallet. Inside was a faded photograph. The same photograph from the pendant. She had carried it all these years. "I kept hoping." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. Hope. Such a small word. Yet it had survived 8 years. She looked toward Grace. The German Shepherd seemed older now that the mystery had been solved. Not weaker, just wiser. As though she had spent years carrying a journey nobody could see. Then Sarah noticed something unusual. One of the puppies had wandered away from the group and curled up directly against the pendant resting beside Emma's bag. The tiny pup was the smallest of the litter. A female with bright amber eyes and a distinctive patch of sable fur across her chest. Emma noticed it too. She smiled. "She looks just like Daisy did." Sarah glanced between the puppy and Grace. The resemblance was impossible to miss. For a moment, nobody spoke. Outside the window, autumn leaves drifted across the shelter grounds. The mountain stood quietly beneath the afternoon sky. Inside, 3 generations shared the same room. A dog who had finally come home, a young woman who had never stopped believing, and a tiny puppy who seemed to carry a familiar spark from the past into the future. Watching them together, Sarah realized the story was no longer about finding what had been lost. It was about what would happen next. As the weeks passed, the shelter slowly prepared for a goodbye that nobody was quite ready to face. The puppies grew stronger every day. Their eyes opened fully. Their personalities began to emerge. Some were adventurous. Some were shy. Some followed Grace everywhere they could manage on unsteady little legs. Yet the smallest female remained different. She spent more time near Emma than the others, often curling up beside her shoes whenever she visited. Sarah noticed it first during a quiet Saturday morning. Emma was sitting on the floor of the maternity room sorting adoption paperwork, while Grace rested nearby. One by one, the puppies wandered around the blankets. The smallest female crossed the room and settled directly in Emma's lap. Grace lifted her head and watched. Then, to Sarah's surprise, the older dog gently stood, walked over, and placed her chin across Emma's knee. The image stopped everyone in the room. It felt less like a coincidence and more like a decision, as though Grace had chosen something. Over the following days, the pattern repeated itself. No matter where Emma sat, the little puppy found her. No matter which volunteer carried her away, she eventually returned. The shelter staff began smiling whenever it happened. Even Sarah could not ignore it. One afternoon, she finally looked at Emma and asked, "Have you thought about taking one home?" Emma laughed softly. "I have thought about it every single day." Her eyes drifted toward Grace. "But I do not want to separate them." Sarah looked at the German shepherd mother. Grace seemed peaceful now. The restless searching was gone. The constant attention toward doors and hallways had disappeared. She no longer waited for someone to arrive. She had found what she was looking for. That evening, after the shelter closed, Sarah stayed late completing reports. Through the office window, she watched Emma sitting beside Grace under the warm glow of a reading lamp. The puppies slept in a tangled pile of fur and tiny paws. Outside, autumn had begun giving way to early winter. The first light snowflakes drifted through the parking lot. Inside, everything felt warm, safe, complete. Then something unexpected happened. Grace stood and walked toward Emma carrying the old pendant in her mouth. The leather cord brushed against the floor as she approached. Emma looked down in surprise. Grace gently placed the pendant in her lap. Then she sat beside the smallest puppy and rested her paw against her. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Sarah felt a strange tightness in her throat. Emma carefully picked up the pendant and stared at the faded photograph hidden inside. The same photograph she had carried in her wallet for years. The same photograph that had led them back together. Tears filled her eyes again. Not the tears of loss this time. Something softer. Something grateful. Grace leaned against her shoulder and closed her eyes. Watching from the doorway, Sarah suddenly understood the meaning of the moment. The pendant had carried the past. The puppy represented the future. And somehow Grace stood between both worlds, connecting them. The mystery that had begun during a stormy night at the shelter was finally transforming into something else. Not simply a reunion. Not simply a miracle. It was becoming the start of a new chapter for a family that had once believed their story was over. Winter arrived quietly in the mountains. Snow settled across the valleys surrounding Cedar Valley Animal Shelter, covering fences, rooftops, and pine trees in soft white silence. Months had passed since the stormy night when Grace's puppies were born. The shelter looked different now. Not because the building had changed, but because everyone inside carried a story they would never forget. One by one, the puppies found homes. Families drove through snow-covered roads to meet them. Children laughed as they held them for the first time. New beginnings unfolded in living rooms, backyards, and quiet country homes across Montana. Yet one puppy never left. The smallest female remained exactly where Grace seemed to have wanted her all along. With Emma. On a bright December morning, Sarah stood outside the shelter entrance watching a familiar pickup truck pull into the parking lot. Emma stepped out carrying the little German shepherd puppy in her arms. The puppy had grown considerably, but she still possessed the same bright amber eyes and sable markings that reminded everyone of Grace. Behind them, Grace walked proudly through the snow. No leash. No hesitation. Just confidence. Home no longer felt like a place she needed to search for. Sarah smiled as they approached. "Looks like somebody is settling in nicely." Emma laughed. Both of them. Grace pressed against Emma's side while the puppy bounced through the snow, leaving tiny tracks behind. The sight filled Sarah with quiet satisfaction. Some stories ended with answers. Others ended with healing. This one had somehow found both. Later that afternoon, after paperwork was complete and final adoption records were signed, Sarah watched Emma prepare to leave. The old pendant rested safely around Emma's neck now. The faded photograph remained inside. The words "come home, Daisy" were still visible when the light hit the metal just right. Grace seemed to notice it every time. Before getting into the truck, Emma knelt beside the dog and gently touched her forehead. "We made it," she whispered. Grace's tail moved slowly through the snow. Not excited. Content. The kind of contentment that comes after a very long journey. As the truck disappeared down the road, Sarah remained standing outside the shelter. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air. The mountains stretched across the horizon beneath a pale winter sky. For a moment, she thought about all the years that had passed before Grace arrived. All the miles. All the unanswered questions. All the moments when hope could have faded but somehow survived. Then she thought about the puppies. About Emma. About the tiny female German shepherd who now carried the next chapter forward. Sometimes people believe miracles arrive as dramatic events. A sudden rescue. A life-changing discovery. A perfect ending. Sarah had learned something different. Sometimes miracles arrive quietly. A worn pendant hidden beneath years of fur. A photograph preserved against impossible odds. A dog who never forgot where she belonged. And a family that never stopped waiting. The snow continued to fall as daylight slowly faded across the valley. Somewhere beyond the mountains, Grace lay beside the people she loved. Her daughter slept nearby. The pendant rested safely against Emma's heart. And for the first time in 8 years, nobody was searching anymore. They were home.